Bernie Sanders made a surprising run for president in 2016, challenging Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. Although he was not expected to win, the amount of support he was able to gather exceeded the expectations of many. He continues to be popular, as evidenced by the massive amount of money he was able to raise following his recent announcement to run for president in 2020. Moreover, some polls suggest that he is a top contender for the Democratic nominee. Needless to say, Bernie Sanders is no longer running as an underdog. One of the most notable features of Sanders is his lasting impact on the Democratic Party. As an NPR article puts it, many of the issues he has promoted for years have shifted from the party's fringe to its mainstream, and are now seen as an effective litmus test for presidential candidates. Fox also notes that the rallying cries that distinguished Sanders from Hillary Clinton in 2016 are no longer unique positions. These policies include things like raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour, guaranteeing health care as a right, combating the unequal distribution of wealth, and offering free college to those who want to get an education. His support for these views is wrapped up in a label he calls democratic socialism. Sanders would frequently point to countries like Denmark and Sweden, and claim that they are experiencing a great deal of success and can serve as models that the U.S. can learn from. The term democratic socialist is bound to be controversial, especially since the word socialism is often viewed in a negative light. Although definitions vary, one way of thinking about socialism is as an economic system in which the production and distribution of goods are controlled substantially by the government rather than by private enterprise, and in which cooperation rather than competition guides economic activity. Although this may not appear to be bad at face value, it is easy to find criticisms of it. For example, one article claims that socialism is a flawed system based on completely faulty principles that aren't consistent with human behavior and can't nurture the human spirit. Later on it adds that, while it promised prosperity, equality, and security, it delivered poverty, misery, and tyranny. Equality was achieved only in the sense that everyone was equal in his or her misery. Even the term democratic socialism is under fire. Although some emphasize that this approach is distinct from socialism, potentially making it immune from some of the criticisms that socialism often receives, others claim that it differs from socialism only by a degree. Of course, these claims do not go without their own set of objections, with some highlighting the successes that these types of policies have had in some countries. Given the controversy surrounding the term, it may be expected that a figure like Bernie Sanders will produce a number of different responses. In this video, I'll offer a brief snapshot at how two outlets discussed his decision to run for president in 2020, especially with regards to his political approach and socialism. According to a Fox News segment, one host notes that more and more people are supporting the socialist agenda, and that's what you're getting with him. Another contrasts Bernie's views with how Trump has recently condemned socialism. He also warns against socialism by referencing what is happening in Venezuela. He claims that it is a case in point of what could happen to America. They have gone into the toilet as a country. They can't even stock their shelves with food that would be too expensive to buy anyway because of inflation. Another article quotes the Republican National Committee, saying that Bernie Sanders is a self-avowed socialist who wants to double your taxes so the government can take over your health care. The vast majority of voters oppose his radical agenda, just like they are going to oppose all the 2020 Democrats who have rushed to embrace it. This quote describes a few things worth noting. First, it highlights that Sanders will raise your taxes, a phrase which is more personal and directed at the reader than merely saying that he wants to raise taxes. Additionally, rather than simply saying that the government will provide health care, it cites the RNC saying that the government will take over this field. For some, this phrase may have a less charitable and more authoritarian ring to it. Finally, with regards to the popularity of his views, the article suggests that they are radical and opposed by many people. Another article quotes the National Press Secretary, who says that Bernie Sanders has already won the debate in the Democrat primary, because every candidate is embracing his brand of socialism. She then adds that the American people will reject an agenda of sky-high tax rates, government-run health care, and coddling dictators like those in Venezuela. Only President Trump will keep America free, prosperous, and safe. Not only does this quote discuss the opposition that Sanders' policies will face from voters, but it also contrasts him with the good that Trump will produce. The charge of being a socialist was emphasized against Sanders in another news segment. The host described Sanders as a self-described democratic socialist, with another woman emphasizing that, although Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, he's really just a socialist. A third woman cites a poll showing that a high percentage of Democrats have a positive view towards socialism. She then goes on to reference Venezuela, noting that, look at what socialism does. Look at what the nationalization of industries like oil, banking, agriculture does to an economy that was once one of the richest economies in Latin America and is now so poor. You have a point where 14-year-olds are literally selling their bodies to try to make money. You have women who were formerly doctors, teachers, doing the exact same thing. She then discusses the riots, shortage of food, and the government control that is occurring, which she contrasts with the freedom that America believes in. With that said, another interviewer referred to this as scare tactics, adding that, I don't think anyone sees us headed in the direction of Venezuela. They just don't see that. They know that's not what Democrats are selling. They don't see the United States of America in any way heading in that direction. At Vox, the coverage of this topic was somewhat different. One article focuses primarily on how Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders are more popular than Donald Trump. It discusses some of the demographic differences in support between Biden and Sanders, while also mentioning Trump's bad ratings. This point is highlighted in another article, which discusses polling that shows the popularity of both Biden and Sanders. Another also discusses the support that Sanders has. It then goes on to talk about how the Democratic Party has become more liberal and is moving to the left. It notes that the party is more likely to embrace progressive policy positions. Soon after, it adds that these are the conditions under which a Sanders victory becomes thinkable. What is noteworthy is that this article does not explicitly say that socialism, specifically, is gaining more and more support. Similarly, another article describes Bernie as the leader of the push to move the party leftward, again neglecting to use the term socialist or democratic socialist. This pattern is observed elsewhere. After discussing the support he has in some of his positions, another article goes on to label him as a progressive father figure. The term progressive is also used elsewhere in the article, whereas the term socialist or democratic socialist don't appear to be present at all. When speaking on healthcare, the article says that his approach is one of the most prominent progressive healthcare policies and increasingly popular among Americans. It may also be worth considering how the article covers the topic of taxes. It does talk about how Sanders' policy will increase them. However, it explicitly says that this is aimed primarily at millionaires and billionaires. This places the focus of the tax increases on the very wealthy, in contrast to the Fox News article, which seemed to make a more general claim about tax increases impacting the reader. Interestingly, I did encounter one article which described Sanders as a socialist. However, strong criticisms aren't made against socialism, and the current state of Venezuela isn't mentioned, as was the case on numerous Fox News reports. At this point, it's probably worth considering a couple key differences on how this topic is covered, based on the articles I've discussed. First, there can be variation based on how Sanders is described or identified. Whereas some may describe him as a progressive or as more left-leaning, others are more likely to use the word socialism or democratic socialist. Second, there are differences in how socialism is discussed and what it's associated with. Fox News constantly brought up the case of Venezuela and linked the difficulties it is facing with socialism. Such seems to be a warning sign for what may happen in the U.S. At Vox, this type of association was absent in all the articles I read. Third, there was also some differences in how taxes were discussed. While reading Fox News may lead you to think that you will be taxed more, reading Vox may give you the impression that taxes will be aimed primarily at the very wealthy. Other slight differences were present to varying degrees as well. There are also some more general questions worth considering when making up our mind on this matter. First, what should we make of socialism and/or democratic socialism? What is the difference? How big is the difference? And are they really as bad as some say? On the other hand, are they really as promising as others claim? To assess this, it may be worth considering whether the examples that people bring up are valid. Although this is a broad topic, I'll offer a few thoughts on the matter. When it comes to critics of socialism, Venezuela is often brought up as a prime example of how it can produce disastrous outcomes. Yet, it's worth asking, is socialism really causing Venezuela's troubles? And is associating Sanders' policies with what's happening in Venezuela really justified? While you can certainly find articles implying that socialism is the cause of Venezuela's situation, others suggest that it is caused by different factors, such as economic warfare. In fact, you can even find those who question whether Venezuela is truly as socialist as critics claim. Of course, those opposed to socialism may say that this is a common fallacy of its supporters. Whenever socialism fails, they simply claim that it wasn't real socialism as a way to avoid acknowledging that their system doesn't work. On the other hand, what about the successes that countries that Sanders cites as models for the U.S. to learn from? Do they really espouse socialism or democratic socialism? Some question if this is the case, and the Prime Minister of Denmark, a country that Sanders often points to, claimed that, "I know that some people in the U.S. associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy." This controversy even bleeds into what term best describes what Bernie Sanders actually believes. Without getting into all the details, there are a host of articles which seem to paint him in different ways. From an outsider's perspective, one may be inclined to give up even trying to come up with a label to describe him, and instead just focus on what specific policies he is advocating for. This reflects how difficult it can be to discuss these issues. Not only is there a lack of agreement over what countries count as socialist or democratic socialist, but there are also disagreements about why so-called socialist countries have failed. Different explanations can be found, and it can be difficult to determine how much of a country's economic problems are due solely to socialist policies, and how much is due to other factors that are all mixed in together. What does seem clear is that where one gets their information has the potential to have a large influence on what factors get cited and what perspectives get promoted. Given this, it seems prudent to not make judgments based solely, or even primarily, on the labels that people apply to themselves, or that are applied to them by others. Instead, we should take the time to get to know the specifics of what they are trying to accomplish and how they plan to do it. When assessing the effectiveness of a given policy, it can be useful to look for other places where similar policies have been implemented. However, once again, we should be cautious about only looking at labels. Just because someone says they are a socialist, and just because somebody calls a country socialist, does not necessarily mean that the two have much in common. It is best to look at the specifics of the policies to see whether the comparison is valid. It should also be noted that the broader context of these comparisons is important as well. One country may want to implement democratic socialist policies because they see other countries successfully implementing them. However, it's important to consider how similar the countries are as a whole. If the two countries are different in a number of ways, then it may not be useful to compare how they will respond to a few similar policies. This is because, at least in principle, a policy in one social context can produce different outcomes when compared to a very similar policy in a different social context. Just like the same medication can help one person and create an adverse reaction in another, even though both suffer from the same disease, so public policies don't, in and of themselves, need to have a uniform outcome across all of their applications. So in short, we should make sure we understand what other people really stand for, rather than form an opinion about them based solely or primarily on a label that is applied to them. We also need to be careful when assessing a given policy based on what is happening in other countries, since cross-country comparisons may not always be valid. I also think it's worth considering how things are described and the wording that is used. Bernie Sanders' opponents may describe his policies as the government taking over our lives and limiting our freedom. Supporters, however, will say that he is simply addressing the rights and needs of people in order for them to live a better life, by taxing those who have too much wealth and power. Although this may utilize more government involvement in our daily lives, it may not be fair to paint helpful government programs as taking over, which is a phrase which could have a more authoritarian or exploitative connotation. Similarly, when Sanders speaks of free college or free healthcare, some may question if this is a misleading phrase. While using the word free may sound appealing, some would contend that it doesn't really capture the reality of the situation. What is really happening is that these goods are being provided by taxpayers, which could include you and me. For them, this is a sort of, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, sort of a situation. Nothing is free, and this needs to be acknowledged. At the same time, while those who emphasize Sanders' high tax rates may portray it as the government taking your money, this may be only part of the story. It's not enough to say that the government is taking your money in the form of taxes. You must also consider what you are getting back in return. Supporters of Sanders may be willing to concede that taxes will go up. However, they will be quick to point out that this will be offset by the services we receive from the government, such as healthcare. Of course, critics question whether the government is truly going to be effective at providing optimal healthcare, giving rise to another element of this debate. The main point I want to emphasize here is that the way that people describe something can have an influence on how we perceive it. Perspective can be powerful. It can cause two people to look at the same thing and walk away with very different views on it. This is also something to be aware of when we are getting our information from different media outlets who may emphasize one particular angle on a given topic to the neglect of others. With that said, I'll wrap things up here. Although a lot more could be said on this matter with regards to Bernie Sanders, the 2020 presidential race, and the various issues related to socialism, its definition, its varieties, and its impact, hopefully this has offered some food for thought when thinking about these issues. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.